Good morning, all, or I guess it's good afternoon at this point. President Whitman, classmates and alumni, family, friends, faculty. In 1952, not long after my classmates and I were born, a novelist named L.P. Hartley began work on The Go-Between, a novel set during his boyhood in England a half-century earlier. The book begins with this: the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Today, we travel back to the foreign country of our own past to see how different Hamilton was and how differently we did things there. How to begin? Well, according to the Old Testament, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Sometime later, the Board of Trustees said, "Let there be Dunham," and there, unfortunately, was Dunham. When 255 of us arrived on campus in September of '69, a banner on the front of the building said, "Aaron Burr Lucky Shot Memorial Dormitory." A good joke, perhaps, but a bad omen. Our first sight of those faceless halls and Spartan living spaces was something like Freud's primal scene, a traumatic event leading to neurosis, curable only by death or dementia. "There's something about my room," went a letter to a parent. "The walls are cinder block, the rug is spotted, and the curtain rods and shades are broken. And I'm surrounded by freshmen." It was true. Except for the lucky few housed in South, we'd all been sentenced to live in a ghetto of enforced familiarity with the members of our own class. Despite the many epithets we hurled at Dunham, no one captured it as succinctly as one of our lit professors, Tom Johnston. He called the building a triumph of economy over the imagination. So is it any surprise that the correctional facility decor and the terrible proximity of our roommates conspired to produce a certain amount of antisocial behavior? Peter Zakari still tells the story of how he filled up John Zeringer's room with wadded up newspapers. I know that's true because I helped Peter do it. And I suspect there are others present today who also participated, but I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. Steve Cotton, who came to Hamilton because, as he said, a Kirkland student smiled at me during my college tour, was soon seen wielding a flaming hockey stick as he chased a naked classmate down the hall. Ben Sol's roommates gave him such a hard time that he borrowed a tent from the outing club and camped out for 3 nights in Kirkland Glen. Tom Palmer said his roommate threatened to kill himself every single day, but wound up graduating with the rest of us. Naturally, the roommate became a psychologist. All of us felt we'd been incarcerated in a place where solitary confinement might have made a welcome change, which maybe explains why the college motto is "Know thyself, not love thy neighbor." Still, in the crucible of Dunham, a wonderful alchemy also took place. For familiarity breeds contempt, it also fosters intimacy. It gave us the unrepeatable opportunity to form close friendships, many of which have lasted to this day. Mine with Roy Schecter, who lived across the hall, is paying off as we speak. He agreed to write this letter if I would deliver it. And Roy swears that not a single word of this is taken from a chatbot. We are both grateful to the classmates, the numerous classmates who shared their memories with us, their friends, their teachers, and their misadventures at Hamilton. Speaking of which, on our first night here, we had dinner in Commons with our faculty advisors. In the middle of the meal at Sid Werdermer's table, a classmate, who we shall not identify, asked for a bowl of peas to be passed. With his voice unheard over the ambient clatter, he made several more requests of increasing volume and intensity, but to no avail. Finally, just as the noise level happened to dip, he shouted, "For Christ's sake, pass the fucking peas." A shocked and stony silence fell upon the table, and everyone turned toward Mr. Werdemer. "Well, you heard him," he said. "Pass the fucking peas." One witness to this incident, Eric Thorkelson, said it felt like a welcome to college moment. We would be treated as if we were adults. After Sid's welcome surprise, we were treated to his surprising welcomes. Thanks to the funny book photos and his phenomenal memory, he greeted each of us by name the first time we crossed paths on campus, except that is when he ran into Michael Bennett, whose photo had been mistakenly swapped in the funny book with David Benke's. "Sorry, Bennett, not Benke," Mike said, but to this day, his Hamilton friends still call him Benke. So what was this college we'd been welcomed to? Was it the tradition-bound, isolated isle of academia to which we'd applied? Not exactly. This was '69, as Connie noted, the aftermath of an ugly year in American history, marked by assassinations, riots, sit-ins, and divisive protests against the war in Vietnam. The election of Richard Nixon had widened the so-called generation gap, and the upstarts of our generation were making waves in American society. The college, though sequestered in its ivory hilltop, felt compelled to move with the tide. As a result, we were the first entering class to be unburdened by distribution requirements, the first with no Saturday morning classes, the first to take 4 courses a semester instead of 5, and the first to undertake the winter study program in January. With the sexual revolution well underway, we were also the first to enjoy the abolition of parietals. You could have a girl in your room day or night, if only there'd been enough of them to go around. Kirkland had been invented, but not quite in the nick of time. It was only halfway to achieving critical mass. Tommy Thompson recalls that at our freshman mixer, a wave of upperclassmen swept through the crowd, and suddenly all the women were gone. As classes got underway, we strolled from one to another along the red shale paths and became more aware of our surroundings. Some of the buildings were a century or two old. The sense of the past was palpable. All the Hamilton professors were men and preferred to be called Mr. All the dorms were single sex. The Bundy residence halls were under construction, and there was talk of replacing Truax with a new library. The chapel bell rang 50 minutes after the hour to signal the end of classes, 10 minutes later to signal the start of the next. But good luck hearing any of that in the old science building, where every clock had its own time zone. We were wowed by the spectacular fall colors, but were unaware the elm trees were dying, including the double-trunked one behind Bristol that had cradled Liza Minnelli a year earlier. Maid service in Dunham was performed by women we called harpies. They came and went like gusts of wind in Greek mythology. Smith's laundry service washed our sheets and towels, which we slung over our shoulders, marching in a weekly caravan between Dunham and the pickup in Bristol. Doug Jones says it looked like a hobo parade. We occasionally hitched rides into Clinton, and with the little money we had, opened savings account at the Hayes National Bank and visited Don's Rock, the favorite alternative to the pub. On weekends at 1 a.m., we could catch the aroma of Jake's fresh-baked raisin bread, and when our parents visited, they took us to dinner at the Alexander Hamilton Inn and bought us toothpaste or whatever at the drugstore on Park Row. It was housed in the original location of the Clinton Pharmaceutical Company, founded in 1887 by 2 guys named Bristol and Myers. Early on, we learned about Hamilton traditions, first and foremost, the fraternity system. If you wanted good food, a desirable room, and a place to party, you joined a house, and 70% of upperclassmen did. Fraternity rushing was more strictly regulated than the banking industry. Which tribe would you choose, and which would choose you? The process was like a well-organized cattle auction. Hazing was outlawed, though perhaps more in theory than in practice. Frat houses were the sites of house party weekends where feral conduct was fueled by huge quantities of alcohol. When the film Animal House was released several years later, we all thought it was a documentary. A more sober tradition was the Hamilton College Cool, an attitude combining nonchalance with steely critical reserve. In lieu of ever applauding a fine performance, we did this. Still can do it, despite the arthritis. Then there was the roll, the venturing forth on weekends in search of female companionship that Kirkland could not yet fully supply. Wells and Skidmore were among the favored destinations, and Bob Rooney recalled that on one expedition, the Deeks brought 2 rider trucks filled with mattresses and stacked cases of beer. It looked like the Marines had invaded Cazenovia. As the leaves began to fall and the October air turned bitter, we recalled Yogi Berra's remark about left field at Yankee Stadium. It gets late early out here. And so the winter arrived, alarmingly ahead of schedule. The snow piled up well before Thanksgiving, and the polar wind that swept across the hilltop made even the guys from Chicago look forward to the holiday break. Then, like the man who came to dinner, winter overstayed its welcome. When we were seniors, it snowed 4 inches on my birthday, May 17th. As the big chill set in, we suffered from overheating in the dorms. If Al Gore knew how much oil and gas the college consumed back then, he'd have a heart attack. For more bracing indoor temperatures, we spent evenings in the clammy and somber stacks of the old James Library. It was private, just you and the books. It was easy to imagine the ghost of Melanchthon Wolsey Stryker haunting the aisles, and if you died up there, no one would find you for 3 days. For indoor exercise, however, the options were extremely limited. The Sage Ring track was even colder than the one outside. There were no treadmills, stationary bikes, or Nautilus machines. The basketball court in the alumni gym was an ode to claustrophobia. The pool resembled the one in a famous scene in the 1942 horror film Cat People. The squash courts were like padded cells without the padding, and the locker rooms had an air of purgatorial gloom. 5 years after we graduated, a senior was amazed by the brand new field house. It's like you're not at Hamilton anymore, he said. The Hamilton he was referring to was the Hamilton we were at. Apologies, by the way, for continuing to mention my name so often. We found ourselves living in the land of the dreaded yes papers, the boot camp that trained raw recruits to do battle with the English language. One grammatical error on an essay, one slip of the typewritten tongue could be fatal. Those of us armed with AP credits skipped English 11 and wrestled instead with Chaucer, Spencer, Shakespeare, and the critiques of our professors. Anyone who thought of himself as a good writer abruptly learned that he wasn't. One of the teachers who made that fact witheringly clear was the notorious Ivan Markey. For him, freshmen were like goats trapped in tiger country. Many were the victims of his soul-crushing commentary. Facing a fractured piece of prose, he would ask, "Is English your native language?" Or in an essay he almost liked, "This is okay as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far." When Arthur Rosenfeld caveated an opinion as "just my 2 cents," Markey said, "Tell me, young man, is that legal tender?" Since Professor Markey's own native language was Hungarian, it was a wonderful irony that he bullied us into appreciating our own. The way he pronounced certain words like recreation instead of recreation cut to the bone of their original meaning. Still, it was gratifying to learn later on that his French wife intimidated him as much as he intimidated us. John Ulrich, a young English teacher, seemed to model himself on Ivan the Terrible. When Peter Bernstein asked, "Professor, would it be correct to say that this work could be thought of as a masque, as in M-A-S-Q-U-E? Ulrich responded, "No, as in N-O." We soon discovered that the insistence on effective written and oral expression extended well beyond the English department. It was a campus-wide conspiracy. Other professors who had no business worrying about sentence structure and semicolons got into the act of correcting our mistakes. Eventually, however, we understood that writing was not our fundamental challenge, it was thinking. Because to write or speak clearly, you had to think clearly, and that is what our teachers taught us to do. In biology, Steve Pribbett remembers that Duncan Chicoine always made you think about the reasons that make nature what it is. He wanted us to know our material well, be observant, and think clearly about what we observed, a lesson we could apply to other disciplines. In public speaking, Warren Wright, Leif Todd, and Bob Mumbles Carson helped us to order our thoughts, consolidate our ideas, and deliver them forcefully and persuasively. Asian Ed Lee, so called because he taught Asian history, was a mentor of sheltering kindness. Generous with his time, he was always available to talk with us about Japan or China, or in confidence, everything the college administration was doing wrong. Phil Pearl was famous for his course, The Physicist's View of Nature, better known as Physics for Poets, poets being a euphemism for idiots. It gave the humanities majors a chance to tell their parents they'd actually taken a science course. Pearl was known as 59-minute Phil because as we all know, when you're teaching about relativity, time doesn't really exist. Russell Blackwood, chair of the philosophy department, taught Islamic, Hindu, and Buddhist thought, and his course on the history of Western philosophy was among the toughest this side of organic chemistry. In it, we encountered the paradox of his grandfather's axe, whose handle and blade had been replaced years after Grandpa had bought the farm. Russell taught us that the real is the rational, and the rational is the real, though recent American history seems to call that into question. David Ellis, universally known as Spoolie, was as vivid a personality as any character actor in Hollywood. His lectures, punctuated with the hand motions that made him famous, turned the melting pot of America into a salad bowl. He knew everything about the history of New York State, except apparently the Battle of Saratoga, claiming that nothing historical had ever happened north of the Mohawk River. In the math department, John Anderson could write theorems across 3 blackboards in under 3 minutes. His group oral exams played out like a round of Jeopardy, where, lacking a buzzer, you raise your hand if you knew the answer. From personal experience, I can tell you it was terrifying. Edwin Barrett offered us a puzzler on the first day of his comedy course, presenting a poem by Robert Graves called Down, Wanton Down. We finally figured out it was about a man trying to get his member to behave. Now, there was a problem we could identify with. In his Shakespeare course, Ed helped us interpret the text by acting out key scenes. One day he was King Lear, the next Lady Macbeth. His lectures were a trove of psychological insight, some of it perhaps lost on us at the time. When Marvin Kortler asked, why doesn't Othello just ask Desdemona to explain about the handkerchief, Ed said, well, I guess we just don't ask those kinds of questions, do we? Robin Kinnell started out teaching in the old chemistry building where the basement looked like a laboratory of Dr. Frankenstein. Robin urged his students to check out its store of ancient books, all of which turned out to be in German. He was the master of the monster commonly known as Orgo. The course left Steve Pribbett with permanent PTSD. And like much of the faculty, Robin was allergic to giving out A's even to his best students. Bob Nickerson said he was thrilled to get a D because, as he explained, a D is not an F. We had many brave pre-meds in our class because of persistent grade deflation, a disease peculiar to Clinton, New York, only half of them were admitted to American medical schools, but almost all ultimately made it back in. Steve Weissman, one of the undaunted rejects, went to Perugia to learn Italian, then to medical school in Rome, and after transferring to a US school, made a distinguished career in pediatric medicine. Don Potter was fascinated by rocks and had a talent for conveying it to his students. He took them, his students, not his rocks, on field trips in the Adirondacks and won grants from NASA and the National Science Foundation. Don gave Peter Slurb his first chance to do scientific research, launching a career in which he literally took aim at the stars. For the last 20 years, Peter has been teaching computational physics at UMass, thanks in part to Peter Millay, who encouraged him to use computers in research. Of course, the only computer on campus back then was a teletype machine connected to a mainframe at nearby Griffiths Air Force Base. During our time here, there was a schism in the psychology department with the Skinnerians, a hometown favorite, you might say, versus the Freud-Young contingent led by the venerable Charles Godcharles. His lecture consisted of long, complex, slowly unwinding sentences, booby-trapped with dependent clauses and digressions, yet grammatically unassailable. In Psych 11, though, he was stuck with the rats in the Skinner boxes used to demonstrate BF's theory of stimulus and response. In a humor issue of The Spectator, Professor Godcharles was parodied as Chuck Godchuck, a Joseph Mengele-type figure who got a charge out of tormenting the rodentia. And here we pause for a true crime story. Each student in Psych 11 was assigned his own rat, and if your rat died, you flunked the course. Jeff Gorn and Ken Givens were in the class with Chuck Patolo, whom they knew to be the most exacting and conscientious student alive. So it was a shock to them when Chuck's rat kicked the bucket. Except it wasn't Chuck's. It belonged to another student who'd pulled a switch. Alas, he'd chosen the wrong guy's rat to mess with because Chuck, being Chuck, could prove the corpse was an imposter and that his red-eyed protege was in the full bloom of health. The ruse was discovered, and so was the perpetrator, who could not truthfully point to the live rat and say, "This is my own work unless otherwise indicated." Incidentally, the honor code came in handy in other unexpected ways. Richie Cavish remembers an intramural softball game in which a runner trying to score on a sacrifice fly left third base too soon. When an appeal was made, the umpire said, "I didn't see it, but I'm taking your word for it under the honor code, and I'm calling you out." The expert on religious codes, though, was Jay Williams. According to Bob Aiello, the professor opened his eyes to mystical thinking. His lectures on Chartres Cathedral immersed us in the faith and culture of the medieval world. One day in his course on Chinese philosophy and religion, he announced that he'd soon be discussing the Tao, which he said was ineffable and not noetic. In other words, inexpressible via words or the intellect. Phil O'Neill raised his hand. "If the Tao is ineffable and not noetic," he said, "then what are you going to talk about?" On the last day of Religion 11 class, a few of us sat in the front row and tried to levitate Mr. Williams. But even in his spiritual matters, he was a true Hamiltonian, class of 54, and his feet never left the ground. On the other hand, when Austin Briggs really got going, he seemed to take wing. His lectures had a heightened, almost hypnotic quality, and at the close of his classes in Gothic lit, he urged us to go forth and wrap your cloaks tightly around you, as if the jitney made stops in Transylvania. But British lit, Conrad, Yeats, Joyce, and Woolf was Austin's true love. He made us feel the emotional resonance of literature and left us with more questions than answers. Ray Tillett says he's still thinking about some of them. And sometimes it's a teacher's voice we remember. Dave Millar's was soothing with a hint of smoke that came from the pack of cigarettes he was never without. A consummate lecturer on American colonial and diplomatic history, he was not above practicing a little stagecraft. One day he entered the classroom flourishing a stack of notes. He sent them down a lectern, then walked away and spent the next 50 minutes speaking from the other side of the room. His Vietnam lecture turned out to be about the Boer War in disguise, 2 entries in what Barbara Tuchman called the March of Folly. Like the sword of Damocles, though, Vietnam hung over our heads during our time at Hamilton. So did the phys ed requirement, which frankly was more immediate concerning to most of us. But there was hope even for the non-aquatic among us. Swim coach Eric McDonald told Fred Gittner that he didn't care what stroke he used as long as he got from one end of the pool to the other. And we were safe from combat in Vietnam if we remained in college. So it's no surprise that the dropout rate for our class was historically low. But our future was in the hands of the draft lotteries. The posting of the numbers were tension-filled occasions. Peter Brophy remembers a night when the pub was filled with 2 cohorts of heavy drinkers, one celebrating lottery numbers above 300, the other with numbers under 100, drowning their fears in pictures of Utica Club. Our first spring at Hamilton was disrupted by as Connie noted, was disrupted by the bombings of Cambodia and the Kent State shootings. Students voted to boycott classes and marched downtown to protest on the village green. Final exams became mostly optional. President Chandler was openly sympathetic to the anti-war effort, and so were many of our professors. Congressman Al Lowenstein, who led the Dump LBJ movement, made his first visit to campus to warn us about the administration he unwittingly helped bring into power. But no violence occurred on campus that May, though feelings ran hot. Mark Richard criticized the movie MASH because it failed, he said, to address the tragedy of Vietnam. Ralph Stocker remembers one Monday morning in chapel when I thought Mark would never stop talking. But wouldn't you know it, Ralph and Mark have been talking to each other ever since. The late spring protests coincided with the opening of the Afro-American Culture Center on campus. Members of the Black Student Union drew parallels between racism in America and what they called military genocide against their brothers and sisters in Southeast Asia. Discrimination and minority rights continued to be topics of discussion and contention during our time at Hamilton, and so did voting rights and student voter registration. Bill Delaney and 9 other students did some poll watching in Mississippi, where many Black people were prevented from voting at all, while some white people voted twice. In our first spring at first spring at Hamilton, the first Earth Day was celebrated when the chief worry was merely water pollution. Another important issue of the day was abortion. And again, as Connie mentioned, Kirkland's First Lady, Natalie Babbitt, said the issue should be taken out of the hands of the government and be left entirely between woman and doctor, as if in response, New York State legalized the practice that year, 3 years before Roe v. Wade. The volume of intercollegiate sex had no doubt increased as Kirkland reached its full enrollment, and population centers sold condoms and contraceptive foam at 6 campus locations, while Planned Parenthood also established a foothold on campus. The proliferation of drugs was another problematic issue. In our freshman year, a portion of Dunham was known as the flight deck, and not just because it was on the top floor. As you walked down the hallways, you caught the odor of Right Guard deodorant spray used to mask the sweet smell of pot. Now, smoking was one thing, but dealing was another. A few students were suspended or expelled. Ted Guggen, though, was not one of them, saying that at Hamilton he discovered sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and later found out there was nothing left to discover. Meanwhile, the enterprising Dennis Oakes dealt in the world's most powerful drug, music. He sold records out of his room in Dunham, and his ads announced in chapel were pithily effective. The White Album, available now in limited supply. The Beatles didn't come to Hamilton, but other popular groups did. Reviews of their concert were mixed. Sly and the Family Stone, who showed up 2 hours late and played for 45 minutes and then walked out, was either the best or the worst. John Strobel said it was both. Ron Kochman took an ecumenical view, saying there were no bad concerts, and Wes Morosco agreed, wondering why would there be a bad concert? Tim Hogeboom said that after his favorite concert, I kind of lost my hearing for 3 days. Easier on the ears, both ears, was the singing of the college choir under the leadership of Jim Fankhauser. It remained all male until more reinforcements arrived at Kirkland. The choir's spring tours were always a triumph, and the Buffers singing ditties from the college songbook were immensely popular. The speakers who came to campus were generally well respected, but Timothy Leary, the prophet and psychedelic of the psychedelic movement, gave again what the Spectator called so it must be true, a wandering and tediously prolonged address in a stone stream of consciousness style. Most of the speakers held forth here in the chapel, but the biggest draws, like basketball great Bill Russell, were stuck in the gym with its largest seating capacity, and the symphony orchestras were marooned there too, in an acoustical cul-de-sac. A typical Spectator review read, "Music marred by gym." But the gym was also the site of a shocking tragedy our freshman year. At the first home basketball game, the coach, Ken Patrick, collapsed on the court and died. When his young replacement died that summer, it seemed like the gods had put a curse on the program. Tom Murphy, whose high school teams had won 55 consecutive games, took over and lost 25 of his first 26. During one of them, when a dog wandered in and sat down in the middle of the court, the ref instructed Murph to remove it or forfeit the game. "What's the score of a forfeit?" Murph asked. 2-0, the ref said. "Let him sit there. That's as close as we're going to get all year." Not that any of us came here expecting our sports team to be juggernauts. The administration eyed any hint of immoderate success with suspicion. Sure, it was gratifying to win, but losing was educational. Adversity, like the Clinton weather, built character. And our football team had character to spare. After losing 50-0 to Alfred, Mark Rice, the quarterback, was drafted to write the Spectator article about the game. His coach, Don Jones, when excited, would forget Mark's name, often defaulting, "Get in there, Blondie." And in one game, after an early pick six by Andy Sopchak, RPI scored the last 48 points. But in the final contest that season, Andy blocked 2 punts in an upset win at Union. Coach Jones, the father of our classmate Tim, was a realist. "Our opponents are mobile, agile, and hostile," he would say in his pregame speeches. "Now go out there and beat them." And thanks to Mark and Andy and the stellar play of John Gravely and Joe Reagan, they sometimes did. Soccer coach Manfred von Schiller, also known as Coach Von Coach, was a spectacle unto himself. A typical preseason headline read, "Coach Von Schiller, not optimistic." He foresaw disaster around every corner and every corner kick. In one game when Hamilton scored in the opening minute, he turned to his manager and said, "How much time is left in the game?" It's said that soccer is a game of geometry, but when it came to math, von Schiller's specialty was numbers. One day in practice, he told his team to pair off in threes, and during games, he urged his players to keep one eye on the field, one eye on the opponent, and one eye on the ball. They say there's no I in team, but for Coach Von Coach, there were three. The Sage Rink was more than a venue for intercollegiate competition. Midday jungle hockey was immensely popular, and intramural games were fought fiercely there. When Coach Greg Bott's team took the ice, the place was packed with raucous fans, even in sub-zero temperatures. We bellowed and stamped our feet to cheer them on and to keep our blood flowing. The freezing cold was no place for the Hamilton cool. Try snapping your fingers in there and your thumb would fall off. We sometimes threw inanimate objects at the opposing players, and sometimes animate ones too. The team was always fun to watch, and when we were juniors, Doug James, Bob O'Connor, Rick Santa, and goalie Greg Root helped to beat Colgate for the first time since 1925. And in the warmer climb of the Bristol pool, the swim team was hugely successful. At one point, Eric McDonald's squad won 19 meets in a row, and they went 36-4 during our 4 years. Peter Schlurb set school and pool records, and Bruce Rinker and Ed Roston made key contributions. The Winter Spectator Sports provided a much-needed respite from our studies. On certain Saturdays, you could go to a swim meet at 1, a hockey game at 4, and a basketball game at 8. Just what we needed, Dave McKay used to say, a whole day without thinking. The Charlatans entertained us in the Old Minor Theater, mounting productions of classic and contemporary plays. Sandy Faison, one of the stars from Kirkland's charter class, went on to play Daddy Warbucks' secretary in the original Broadway production of Annie. The show's book was written by Tom Meehan, who graduated from Hamilton the year most of us were born. In the fall of our senior year, the Alexander Hamilton Players presented the musical 1776 in the chapel, then took it on tour to great acclaim. David Benke, the real David Benke, stopped the show with a powerful Molasses to Rum the Slaves number. It's worth noting that 1776 opened in the same Broadway theater which now houses Hamilton, that promising little show written by a Wesleyan grad. But as a setting for the Continental Congress, nothing could match the space we're in right now, which a Spectator review praised for its, quote, superb colonial atmosphere. And when we weren't going to plays or concerts or sporting events, we went to the movies. 2 campus film societies showed recent films and masterpieces by Hitchcock, Wells, Berkman, and others. Just before the end of senior year, Mark Richard and Steve Weissman rented a print of John Waters' transgressive comedy Pink Flamingos. Though afraid it might be too much for Hamilton crowd, they had to show it anyway to earn back the money they had already spent. So at a Saturday night screening of Woody Allen's Bananas, they made a strategic announcement saying that Pink Flamingos would be on tap the following week, that it was very funny and was bound to gross out any normal person, but there would be no refunds under any conditions. It sold out 4 nights in a row. Students discussed the films they saw and wrote about them in The Spectator. Mike Murphy published a series of articles about what he called the deep, mysterious symbols hidden within Flash Gordon, thus paving the way for similar treatises on the Star Wars films. We have ample testimony that at the showing of 2001: A Space Odyssey, many of the patrons were indeed very odd. Under the influence of cannabis, they couldn't tell one trip from another, the one on the screen or the one in their heads. But Don Williams said it wasn't about the movie you saw, it was the girl you were with. That was certainly true for Dave Rauscher, who had his first date with Kirkland's Judy Steinlauf at a screening of, wait for it, Rosemary's Baby. Together, they eventually produced 3 children, and none of them is the spawn of Satan. But as moviegoers go, we were a tough crowd. At the now classic Night of the Living Dead, we learned that one sure way to kill zombies was to set them on fire. During one screening, a student fainted and had to be carried out by his friends. As they did, the audience spontaneously chanted, "Burn him, burn him." As I said, we were a tough crowd. Now, in that last story, it may be hard to separate the apocalyptic from the apocryphal, but on the theory that truth is stranger than fiction, here are some weird things that definitely happened back when. Freshman year, just prior to Thanksgiving, we had holiday dinner in Commons where Robbie Brewer's roommate worked. Borrowing a few white coats from his roommate's closet, Robbie and two henchmen entered the dining hall, approached the buffet table, scooped up a half-carved turkey, head faked toward the kitchen, slipped out the side door, and hustled back to Dunham, accompanied by a scrum of accessories after the fact. After devouring the remains of the turkey, they tucked the carcass under the bed covers of Mitch Denker, their resident advisor. Fortunately, Mitch was the kind of guy who knew how to dispose of incriminating evidence. Tim Hogaboom had toured the campus on a dreary day and frankly was not impressed. But Hamilton was the only college that accepted him, so he came. Making the most of it, he went on to become the president of the Hamilton-Kirkland Bumper Sliding Club, whose members enjoyed easing on down the road while holding onto the back bumpers of cars. It wasn't really a club, Tim says, more like a bunch of inebriated idiots with a death wish. The unforgettable Harold Fogg, who didn't make it to commencement, possibly had a death wish of his own. On a foggy night, in front of witnesses, he climbed the stairs to the top of the chapel, then shimmied down the metal lightning rod from the steeple to the ground. Harold also distinguished himself in other ways. Every morning of freshman year, he played Born to Be Wild at maximum volume on the stereo. Fortunately for his roommates, he was not an early riser. When Harold ran out of clothes, he wore Ray Tillett's instead. He also hid drugs in Ray's dresser. "You're so straight," Harold told Ray, "that if they're found, no one's going to believe that they're yours." That was a fair trade, Ray says, because every day with Harold was an adventure. Another classmate who didn't make it to commencement was Chris Rudner, a provocateur who trafficked in illegal substances and traveled in upper-class circles. One day, while visiting a friend in her parents' opulent home, he said, "Do you have a bidet in the bathroom?" "No," she replied, "but there's a Monet in the dining room." Peter Brown used to fly a large biplane glider on the golf course. After graduation, he flew off to Alaska and forgot to come back until now. Though mostly anchored in Anchorage for the past 50 years, he made the long trip to be back with us this weekend. Brian Kavanaugh says that John Clancy Cavino, the proprietor and sole employee of Clancy's Midnight Typing Service, was an unsung hero of our class. As word of Clancy's skills spread around campus, business boomed. Desperate classmates, day and night, formed a queue outside his room, bearing sheets of their handwritten scrawl, trusting that John and his royal typewriter, a manual typewriter, would turn them into something presentable. Brian and John's roommate, Steve Sadoff, would come back from the library asking, "Clancy, don't you have your own work to do?" He did, and he did that too, without fail. Art Dombey remembers falling badly behind in Spanish class, and on many a night in Benedict Hall, he talked to the walls while the steam radiators hissed in response. He behaved wildly on house party weekends while a girl he liked was dating one of his fellow teaks. Unconvinced that Art was a certifiable lunatic, she later agreed to marry him. "If not for Hamilton and Kirkland," he said, "I'd have missed my life." Kurt Marfort was a French major known to discuss Kant and Schopenhauer at 3 a.m. in the pole vault pit, so of course he became an oil exploration geophysicist. He worked for Big Oil and, thanks to his Hamilton education, survived numerous right-sizings, downsizings, re-engineerings, outsourcings, strategic partnerings, co-sourcings, alliancings, and just plain layoffs. Whether Big Oil will survive as well as Kurt did remains to be seen. Steve Gibo recalls the suspense-filled aftermath of a Chi Psi party. Several of the brothers, feeling that Skidmore and Casanova weren't far enough away, elected to drive to Canada. Now, it's possible that alcohol was a factor in their decision. They have no problem crossing the border into Canada. Getting back was considerably more difficult. US Customs officials took a dim view of their appearance, probably because they seemed to be headed to a casting call for drug dealers. The boys were pulled over, questioned, and searched in ways intensely personal, but nothing was found, and when they got back to Chi Psi, they announced their return with an air horn. It was 5 a.m., and the brothers voted to send them back to Ottawa. The college doctor, Hadley Rowe, inevitably known to us as Death Row. One January, my freshman year roommate, O.J. Burns, entered the health center with a minor medical problem, and under the doc's supervision, his condition grew steadily worse and worse. We began to wonder if O.J. would make it out of the health center alive, and then we realized the truth. Doing away with OJ was Doc Rowe's winter study project. Fortunately, he failed, and OJ went on to teach English for 34 years at a school where his students valued him as highly as he valued Austin Briggs and his other teachers at Hamilton. One of them was Fred Wagner, who started here when we did. He believed, as Oscar Hammerstein put it, that if you become a teacher, by your pupils you'll be taught. Fred loved Melville, James, Faulkner, and Tennessee Williams, but hated to lecture. He worked 10 extra hours each week by breaking his classes into small discussion groups. Bruce Rinker remembers him as a man with eyes that always smiled, a cigarette in his mouth, and another waiting in his hand. Fred didn't drink, but advised Eric Allen to do so more often because it seemed to be improving the quality of his insights. Fred's warmth and infectious laugh masked a sharp wit. In later years, he wrote biting comments in the pages of Blue Books, then went back and ripped them off, leaving the students to only imagine what horrors they had perpetrated. Just to find all your corners intact was a triumph. Fred encouraged contrarian opinions, but when a student said something grossly outlandish, he would look around and ask, "Do we all agree with this?" After a class in which someone called the Scarlet Letter a load of garbage, a classmate asked Fred, "Why didn't you straighten him out?" To which Fred replied, "Why didn't you?" That summed up his approach to teaching. He was more interested in what was inside of our heads than in his own. The other teacher who fit that description was Bob Simon. Even students who never took a course with Bob knew that he was a human of rare qualities. Remarkably accessible and humble, he was serious about philosophy, but not about himself. He treated us as equals. In class, he called us Mister, but that was the only formality he observed. His passion for sports figured mightily in his exploration of thorny ethical problems. He taught us that learning to ask the right questions was as important as finding the right answers, though he never stopped searching for those answers. Bob's fallibility was part of his charm. If he said there were 3 important points to remember, he could always remember only 2 of them. Rehearsing a lecture at home for his wife, Joy, he mispronounced the name of Galileo. "For God's sake, Bob," Joy said, "whatever you do tomorrow, don't call him Galileo." But sure enough, the next day, Galileo reared its ugly head. When he was done, the mortified Bob tried to flee the room, but was intercepted by a Kirkland student. "Great lecture, Mr. Simon," she said. "You know, I never realized Galileo's name was pronounced that way." You can't help loving a guy like that, but one of the many reasons we've named our class scholarship in Bob's honor. But this look back at the foreign country of our past would not be complete without a word about Winton Tolles, who was the dean of the college from 1947 until he retired at the end of our junior year. Today, it seems there are deans everywhere in Hamilton, swarms and legions of them. But back then, aside from Hadley Depew, who was dean of the students, functioned more like a parole officer, there was only one dean, and Dean Tolles was it, the unlikeliest looking dean in the history of American education. At the end of a meal in Commons for freshmen and parents, when a portly middle-aged man with a cigarette dangling from his lips and ash on his tie got up to talk, Ralph Stocker's father asked him if this guy was the head of the dining hall. Alan Fisher remembers him standing in the middle of the quad, unzipping his fly and dropping his trousers so he could tuck in his shirt. Though he was known to return from lunch with cheeks flushed and the faint odor of alcohol in his breath, it never dimmed his mental acuity or impaired his common sense. The bulletin board announcements he authored were masterpieces of brevity, clarity, and occasional wit. On the Roots LP that served as a humor issue of The Spectator, he explained that a dog is to a college what a tree is to a dog. But at Hamilton, he was the top dog. In his farewell address, delivered from this very spot, he concluded with the story of an old professor who slips down an icy walk down College Hill and turns into a human sled. He takes on a passenger by running into a portly woman who lands on his stomach. Down the hill they go, picking up speed, crossing Route 233, and stopping in the flatland beyond Oriskany Creek. At which point, the professor looks up at his passenger, tips his hat, and says, "Pardon me, madam, but this is as far as I go." No Hamilton dean has ever gone farther. By our senior year, some things had begun to change. It was big news when Hamilton hired 2 female teachers. Cross-enrollment in courses between the colleges increased. Students voted to establish co-ed dorms, and 2 were set aside for that purpose. The Burke Library opened, and so did Kerner Johnson. Steve Kurtz took over as dean, and economics professor Martin Caravano became the college provost. Despite receiving minuscule support from our student body, Richard Nixon was reelected, and Al Lowenstein returned to tell us about the dirty tricks that eventually led to the Watergate scandal. On May 5th, 1973, a horse named Secretariat won the Kentucky Derby in record time, reaching the finish line 3 weeks before we did. 50 years later, much has changed. Even Sid Werdemer probably couldn't remember all 481 names and faces in last year's freshman class, which was far more diverse than ours in every way. So is the faculty, about half of whom are women. Students call their teachers professor these days, not Mr. or Ms. Most of the dorms are co-ed, some are designed as substance-free, and all are heated more efficiently. The draconian yes papers have faded into history. The chapel bell no longer rings at 50 minutes past the hour. Students have the time of day at their fingertips and computers on their wrists. The Hamilton Cool has warmed up, one proof of which is the astounding roar of approval that greets today's a cappella concerts. A recent Spectator article noted that the students, quote, couldn't imagine going to a college without any decent coffee options, unquote. I don't recall that being a major priority for us. Essential documents are no longer printed. Everything is online, including the catalog and the student directory. Students register for courses online, and announcements are made that way too. The film societies are defunct, replaced by a Hamilton-hosted web channel where students can watch movies on their laptops, or good grief, Mr. Spielberg, on their phones. The students are swamped with emails and texts from all corners of the earth and are tethered to their parents more closely than we were. More parents may have bidets now, though Monets are still hard to come by. Many of the older buildings have been repurposed for other uses. Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory looks like it was remodeled by Jack LaLanne. There are dorm parties instead of house parties, though students still have Greek life and Greek yogurt now too, which, by the way, we need more than they do. There's plenty of space for indoor exercise, and the athletic teams are unapologetically winning championships. Heat was installed in Sage Rink, though whether it works or not is still up for debate. If you don't want to do your laundry, you can pay other students to do it for you. For a fee, you can send a singing buffergram to the special someone of your choice, or for an extra fee, the boys will show up at 6 a.m. on the doorstep of the guy who just stole your girlfriend. The elms were all gone, and so were the red shale paths. Although it still snows here more than in most places, you can sometimes see bare ground between November and April. Economics is now the most popular major. Students are much more focused than we were about getting a good job right after graduation. They don't have to worry about the military draft, but they do have to worry about getting shot by some nut with a gun. When Governor Professor Gene Lewis told us that our cinder block walls were no barrier to .50 caliber machine gun fire, or when a Spectator ran a hoax about a shootout in McEwen over a meal card, we laughed. Nobody's laughing today. At Hamilton today, the men are outnumbered by the women. That fact and look around the campus, the field house and the fitness center, the concert hall and the art museum and the Kennedy Center, the breadth and quality of the food in the dining halls, the variety of options in the residence halls, the well-equipped classrooms, and the science center that seems like science fiction. All these could make us feel that if we'd come too late to be extras in the sterile cuckoo, we also had been born way too soon. Maybe L.P. Hartley was wrong. It isn't the past that's the foreign country, it's the present. They do things differently here. And yet much is the same. The phys ed requirement remains, so does the honor code. The fall colors are still glorious, and students still complain about the weather. The vinyl LP has made a comeback. The blue books are eternally blue. Members of the entering class are officially known as first-year students, but everyone still calls them freshmen. Some of the big issues from 50 years ago continue to be hotly debated and discussed: abortion, racism, drugs, free speech, voter suppression, the fate of the earth. They remind us, as Faulkner did, that the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. As we work, today's Hamilton students are trained for nothing but prepared for everything. They get to know their teachers and hold some of them in awe. They develop the skills that will serve them in ways they can't anticipate. in jobs and careers and lives they can't imagine happening. Learning to think clearly and express yourself cogently. This is the best of all carryover sports. Whether your game is law, business, medicine, science, finance, journalism, education, technology, or others yet to be invented. Speaking of our years at Hamilton, Tim Jones seemed to express the majority opinion of our class. It was the bedrock, he said, for everything good that followed. Or in the words of Peter Splain, the affable seriousness of the place, the intelligence and wit, the calmness of the society, the pleasure of learning, the general goodness of the people here. Perhaps that tells us as much about Peter as it does about college, but that is the Hamilton we like to remember. For each returning alumnus, Sid Werdemer always had 2 words of greetings: welcome home. It still feels like home, even if they've rearranged some of the furniture. It's good to be back.